Barely 10 minutes of footage had been shot, none of which actually featured its main star, when Cleopatra's production took a catastrophic turn. Almost 4 months into production, Elizabeth Taylor collapsed in her London hotel suite and was rushed to the hospital, where doctors diagnosed her with acute pneumonia and warned that without immediate intervention, she only had hours to live. At this point, 20th Century Fox was dangerously close to going under, and the studio was counting on Cleopatra and Elizabeth Taylor to save it. Desperate to secure the biggest star in the world, Fox offered Elizabeth the highest salary ever paid to an actor, hoping her name alone could fill theater seats. Months into production, the plan was not going so swell. Millions had already been poured into massive sets that were falling apart, the script was still unfinished, costs were climbing, and now one element the studio depended on the most was fighting for her life. This is the story of how Cleopatra spiraled into complete chaos due to a desperate studio wagering everything on excess, creating the most expensive film ever made at the time, and one of Hollywood's greatest production disasters. Elizabeth Taylor quite literally became the queen of Hollywood the moment 20th Century Fox came to her on their hands and knees, desperate for her to play Cleopatra. By the end of the 1950s, Elizabeth was no longer bound to her grueling, long-term MGM contract. She was free, and that freedom changed everything. For the first time, Fox wasn't dealing with a controlled asset, but a star who held all the leverage. When Fox approached her about Cleopatra in 1959, according to accounts from Elizabeth herself and from her husband at the time, Eddie Fisher, the discussion unfolded in a classic movie star fashion, with Elizabeth relaxing in her bathtub while Eddie relayed the studio's offer. Her response was simple and bold. She instructed him to tell Fox she would do the film for $1 million, along with a percentage of the film's profits. The demand was staggering, and to everyone's shock, Fox agreed. With that agreement, Elizabeth Taylor became the first actress in Hollywood history to earn $1 million for a single film. To put that figure in perspective, $1 million in 1960 equals nearly $11 million today. It was historic and revealed how desperate the studio had become, and how badly they needed her. Not long before this moment, Hollywood had been a tightly controlled empire. The studio system functioned like a factory, often comparable to the powerful Henry Ford assembly line. Everything was handled in-house, and studio moguls possessed all the power controlling stars, contracts, publicity, and production. Actors dazzled audiences, but they had little real control. They didn't choose their roles, they didn't have the power to approve scripts or directors, and they were bound to long-term, strict contracts that dictated nearly every aspect of their careers. But that Hollywood empire would soon crumble. This was caused by a series of events that caused Hollywood to take a massive hit. In 1948, the Supreme Court ruling in United States versus Paramount Pictures forced studios to give up their theater chains, destroying the guaranteed showing of their pictures that had sustained the system. Soon after, television entered American homes, and weekly moviegoing declined dramatically. Studios responded by pouring money into new state-of-the-art technologies like widescreen formats such as CinemaScope and enhanced color processing, which only really made everything more expensive. At Fox specifically, the damage had become visible. The studio sold off valuable land, scaled back its once sprawling backlots, and watched its financial stability erode quickly. By the time the 1960s arrived, Hollywood was no longer a powerful force. The solution, Fox Studios believed, was to make a massive epic that television could not replicate. Producers looked in their archives and settled on the idea of remaking the 1917 silent film Cleopatra, which was perfect because it was already a story associated with excess and power. They envisioned transforming it into a sweeping, full-color, lavish movie, making it impossible for audiences to ignore. The most important question, though, became obvious. Who would possibly embody Cleopatra, the powerful and seductive Queen of the Nile? Several actresses were seriously considered. Joan Collins completed a screen test, Susan Hayward was discussed, Audrey Hepburn and Sophia Loren were both in contention, but none of them carried the presence required to truly fill the throne of Egypt's most powerful queen. There was one actress, however, that did. By this point, Elizabeth Taylor was the best contender for the role because she already lived like a queen. At just 27 years old, she possessed extraordinary wealth, global fame, and even amassed a jewelry collection that rivaled royal families. In a country without royalty, Elizabeth Taylor was undeniably America's queen. So, for the first time in Hollywood history, the balance of power was shifted. The studio needed the star more than the star needed the studio. Funny enough, before the contract details were fully finalized, Fox staged a highly publicized fake signing ceremony announcing Elizabeth Taylor's record-breaking deal. With this, the studio declared to the world that she would star in their new movie Cleopatra, even though the finer points of the contract were still being negotiated behind closed doors. The spectacle was designed to generate buzz, but it handed Elizabeth Taylor even greater leverage. With the announcement already public, before her contract was even finalized, she was in a position to add further stipulations and demands, and Fox, having already tied its future to her name, had little choice but to comply. With the world watching, Elizabeth demanded everything befitting to a queen: luxurious accommodations and complete deference to her needs. Fox obliged. This was the studio's first irreversible mistake among many. Cleopatra had not even yet begun filming, yet its foundation was already unstable. Decisions were no longer guided by discipline or structure, but literally by desperation. A queen had been crowned, and the empire behind her was already beginning to crumble. Fox Studios was moving quickly to get Cleopatra off the ground and running. Ruben Mamoulian was hired to direct, inheriting a production that was already monumental in scale and dangerously unorganized. Construction of the massive sets began almost immediately, before casting was finalized and long before they even had a script completed. The centerpiece of the movie would be Alexandria, which consisted of a massive outdoor set featuring towering columns, sprawling palace exteriors, and grand dramatic staircases. This was one of the largest sets ever constructed at Pinewood Studios in Iverhealth, England. This set is estimated to have cost the studio $6 million. But why did they choose to go to England? At this point in time, 20th Century Fox no longer had the space, the money, or the stability to produce Cleopatra at home. By the late 1950s, this studio had sold off large portions of its Los Angeles backlot just to stay afloat. So England looked like a great idea. Pinewood Studios had the infrastructure for large buildings, there were foreign tax advantages, and shooting abroad also helped avoid labor issues in Hollywood as a strike was looming. Moving across seas seemed strategic. Filming was slated to begin on September 28, 1960, even though the Alexandria set was still unfinished. Columns were still being adjusted, and palm trees were still being installed, but the production moved forward anyways. Struggling with a lingering respiratory illness. She had a persistent flu that did not mix well with the cold, damp English climate. The weather aggravated her condition. She was frequently unable to shoot, and scenes were constantly rearranged to work around her. Mamoulian tried filming everything that didn't require her presence, but Cleopatra was the film, and without her, there was no movie. The only scene with Elizabeth they were able to film were essentially screen tests like this one. Elizabeth wasn't the only thing deteriorating under the English sky. The weather wreaked havoc on the set. The expensive imported palm trees withered and had to be replaced repeatedly, paint peeled, materials warped, and the gray skies made it impossible to recreate the bright desert atmosphere the story required. The production was hemorrhaging money while producing almost nothing usable. After roughly 4 months of filming, they only managed to have about 10 minutes of footage. The script was still uncompleted, and scenes were constantly being rewritten before they shot them. The logistics of this production was a nightmare, and costs were ballooning very dramatically. On January 18, 1961, Mamoulian had enough and resigned. At this point, the production was in serious trouble, but Fox still tried to salvage the production. Elizabeth suggested Joe Mankiewicz, who had directed her in Suddenly last summer, earning her an Academy Award nomination. Mankiewicz was then brought in. With a new director stepping in, there was renewed hope that Cleopatra could finally find direction and stability. Filming was tentatively scheduled to resume April 4th, 1961, and for a moment it appeared a new leaf was turned. And then the unthinkable happened. Elizabeth Taylor collapsed. The Queen of Hollywood, the woman the studio had bet everything on, was unconscious and fighting for her life. And now the fate of Cleopatra, Elizabeth, and Fox Studios hung by a thread. In March 1961, Elizabeth was rushed to the hospital in London. Doctors determined her lungs were filling with fluid rapidly and her airways were failing. According to her husband, Eddie Fisher, in his autobiography, Been There, Done That, physicians warned that without immediate intervention, Elizabeth could die within an hour. An emergency tracheotomy was performed, but it was unclear if she would be able to pull through. As reporters crowded outside the hospital, confusion escalated. One wire service mistakenly transmitted that Elizabeth Taylor had died, and for a brief moment, newspapers reported her death. Thankfully, the reports were wrong. She miraculously pulled through. Elizabeth later shared that it was a strange experience to read her own obituary in the newspaper, joking that it was the best reviews she had ever received. After roughly a week in the hospital, she was flown back home to the United States to continue her recovery, which would take several months before she was strong enough to return to work. In April 1961, Elizabeth was well enough to attend the Academy Awards, where she won Best Actress for Butterfield 8. After nearly losing her life, the moment felt undeniably triumphant. Yet many viewed the win as a sympathy vote, especially given the public backlash she had faced in the months prior over the scandal involving Eddie Fisher. Regardless of the motive, the Oscar restored her to a position of strength at a time when both her life and career seemed uncertain. Meanwhile, production at Pinewood Studios was officially suspended on March 14, 1961. The entire production was frozen. At that moment, the studio faced a stark choice: abandon the film and absorb the losses, or double down on a gamble that had already spiraled out of control. Fox had already spent millions. Walking away would have meant writing off the entire gamble. So instead, they pressed forward, but this time not in England. Months had passed since the original sets were constructed, and exposure to the damp climate only had worsened their condition. Maintaining them would require even more money, and restoring them to proper film condition, they determined would cost a fortune. If Cleopatra was going to survive, they would completely have to start over in a more stable environment. Cinecittà Studios in Rome. By late summer of 1961, construction of the new set began in Italy. For this second attempt, production designer John DeCure designed the new Alexandria to be even grander than before. This time, he built a replica said to be 3 times the size of the actual Roman Forum. The construction was so extensive that Italy experienced a temporary shortage of building materials because of this movie, and the details were extravagant. Much of the gold seen on screen is actually real gold leaf. Nothing was modest, and the scale of waste became staggering. Martin Landau, who played Rufio, later described the Rome production as a prime example of Hollywood excess. Even the smallest props were immaculately detailed and artisan crafted, but many of them were never even featured in the final movie. Landau recalled watching another actor casually discard an ornate, gold-encrusted cane because he simply didn't feel like using it. Even disposable paper cups used on set racked up a staggering $100,000 bill. By the time cameras were rolling in Rome, the production was burning through nearly $70,000 per day, which is well over $600,000 in today's money. While Fox was pouring all their money into these small details, the story itself still remained unfinished. When Joseph Mankiewicz started on Cleopatra, he approached this film as a serious drama. He wanted political tension, emotional complexity, and sharp, intelligent dialogue. When he reviewed the existing footage from England, he determined that none of it could be salvaged. He rewrote constantly, often drafting pages at night for scenes that would be shot the next morning. The script continued evolving even as the cameras rolled. The studio's concerns were placed somewhere else. They wanted a spectacle so massive it would drag audiences away from their television sets back into theaters. Nuances like story mattered less than size. At this point, it seemed as though no one at Fox was paying close attention to how quickly costs were mounting. In early November 1961, the overtime clause in Elizabeth's contract officially was activated, adding $50,000 for every additional week of shooting. And yet, despite the instability, for the first time since the project began, Cleopatra seemed to be functioning. Elizabeth had fully recovered and was now standing strong as Cleopatra, looking radiant and powerful. For the first half of the film, Cleopatra's political alliance is with Julius Caesar. By this point, a few major roles had been recasted. Rex Harrison assumed the role of Caesar, replacing Peter Finch after Finch withdrew due to scheduling conflicts during the production's suspension. Mankiewicz favored Harrison for his authority and theatrical precision, qualities he believed were essential to portraying Caesar's intellect and dominance. Things were beginning to take shape. The first portion of the film was completed, and Elizabeth was preparing her scenes with the character Mark Antony. Originally, Stephen Boyd had been slated to play Antony during the early phase of production, but as Rome started to regain momentum, Mankiewicz had someone else in mind, someone with greater gravitas. From the very first exchange of dialogue, the tension was unmistakable, and just as the film seemed to steady itself, a new force entered the production, one that would transform this troubled epic into one of the most scandalous stories in Hollywood history. When Richard Burton stepped onto the set as Mark Antony, the production entered an entirely new chapter. Burton would later admit he was intoxicated by Elizabeth from the very beginning. The moment she stepped on set, he was captivated. Biographer J. Randy Tara Borelli, who wrote Elizabeth, points out perfectly that their relationship would begin exactly the way it would continue for decades. Fearlessly, carelessly, passionately, and publicly. Elizabeth would later reflect in her own autobiography that I knew what I was doing was wrong, but I couldn't help loving Richard. At the time, Elizabeth was still married to Eddie Fisher, the same man she had married after the death of her husband, Mike Todd. Eddie had previously been married to her best friend, Debbie Reynolds, and when the affair became public, it exploded into an international scandal that branded Elizabeth as a homewrecker. And even now, on the set of Cleopatra, she often wore Mike Todd's wedding band, not Eddie's, and spoke of Mike frequently. Eddie, by contrast, seemed to fade quietly in the background of her life. The first scene they filmed together would foreshadow the events to come. Cleopatra turns to Antony and says, "To have waited so long, to know so suddenly, without you, this would not be a world I want to live in." Antony responds with, "Everything that I want to hold or love or have or be is here with me now." And then the scene required them to kiss. According to those present, the electricity was unmistakable. The scene had been filmed multiple times, and for the final take, the kiss lingered so long that it began to make people on set very uncomfortable. Director Mankiewicz reportedly shouted, "Cut, cut," but they refused to stop kissing. Not long after, whatever had begun between them no longer confined to the script. Between takes, they kissed freely on set, unconcerned with who might be watching. Fortunately for them, or fortunately for the production, neither of their spouses were present in Rome during those early days. It was only a matter of time, though, before the press discovered Elizabeth's new affair. Photographs of them embracing, laughing, and traveling together began circulating rapidly. Though both publicly denied the relationship at first, the images told their own story. Within weeks, what had begun as on-set chemistry erupted into an international news event. The Vatican publicly condemned their relationship, declaring their conduct immoral and describing Elizabeth as a bad example, even suggesting that Elizabeth should have her children taken away from her. In Britain, the affair was denounced on the floor of Parliament, where members criticized the couple's conduct as disgraceful. Once again, Elizabeth Taylor found herself at the center of a worldwide controversy. It's important to note that unlike today, in the cultural climate of the early 60s, this kind of public affair was unheard of. And Fox executives feared the controversy would ruin the film before it ever reached theaters, and panic set in. Sponsors hesitated, religious groups protested, headlines across Europe and America framed the film not as a grand epic, but as evidence of moral corruption. What the studio heavily miscalculated was the public's fascination. The more the world condemned Elizabeth and Richard, the more audiences wanted to see them. And Cleopatra was the film at the center of the most talked about romance on Earth. And while the scandal raged on, production pressed forward. After illness, resignations, scandal, and staggering expenses, filming in Rome finally wrapped on July 28, 1962. By that point, Fox had spent over $30 million on production alone, and another $15 million would later be poured into promotion and marketing, an unprecedented sum at that time. When all was accounted for, Cleopatra would cost approximately $44 million, making it the most expensive film ever produced up to that time, the equivalent of nearly $500 million today. But the real question remained. After nearly all of this chaos, would Cleopatra save the studio, or would it become the final blow to their already collapsing Hollywood empire? When Cleopatra finally premiered in June 1963, audiences were not simply coming to watch the fall of ancient Egypt grace the big screen. They were coming to see the film that had nearly killed its star and ignited the most talked about romance in the world. Financially, the gamble paid off. Cleopatra became the highest grossing film in 1963 and ultimately earned over $57 million in its initial run. It made back its enormous cost of $44 million, but it still was not enough to justify how expensive it was. For a studio that had staked its future on this production, surviving it all kind of felt like a miracle. Critics of the film were divided. Some praised the film's grandeur and scale, recognizing its achievement as a cinematic spectacle, and it was also recognized by the Academy Awards, winning 4 Oscars for Best Art Direction, Cinematography, Costume Design, and Visual Effects. Many others, like Variety for example, highlighted that while the film was visually impressive, it was far too long, with the second half dragging immensely. Some critics found it lacked human drama, making it difficult to become emotionally engaged with the characters and the story. Joseph Mankiewicz agreed that the storyline suffered. He had originally delivered a cut running over 6 hours and pushed for a 2-part release in order not to sever the story. Fox refused. The movie was reduced dramatically in length to reach theaters quickly to begin recouping its investment. In the process, much of the character nuance and political layering that Mankiewicz had written was stripped away. He was ashamed of what the film became, and it was reportedly the only film he refused to discuss in interviews. Elizabeth later recalled being horrified when she saw the final version, saying it had become little more than a parade of costume changes and that the best elements had been removed. The finished film was undeniably beautiful to look at. The scale is extraordinary, the craftsmanship is evident in every frame, but beauty alone is never enough to stabilize what had been so unstable behind the scenes. And perhaps this is the clearest answer as to why Cleopatra unraveled the way it did. Throughout the production, Fox behaved less like a strategic company in a moment of crisis and more like a studio trying to outrun its own anxiety. Instead of tightening the reins when warning signs appeared, it expanded. Instead of slowing down, it accelerated. When uncertainty grew, the response was not restraint, but enlargement. Bigger sets, larger spectacle, more access. Scale became the solution to every problem. That mindset wasn't unique to Cleopatra or even Fox Studios. It was the industry's response to survival. If television dominated living rooms with the small screen, Hollywood would dominate in scale. Bigger screens, richer color, grander productions. Cleopatra was the movie that simply pushed that philosophy to its absolute limit. After the near catastrophe that was Cleopatra, Fox Studios knew it had to clean its act up fast. Leadership immediately changed. Daryl F. Zanuck, the original founder of 20th Century Fox, returned, removed unstable leadership, and reimposed strict financial and operational discipline across the studio. Production going forward was carefully planned, scripts were completed before filming began, and budgets were managed with discipline rather than desperation. The shift became visible almost immediately. Just 2 years later, in 1965, Fox released The Sound of Music, which was produced on a budget of only $8.2 million. The film became immensely profitable, grossing over $286 million worldwide, more than 30 times its production cost. So in other words, Cleopatra did more than nearly bankrupt Fox. It exposed how fragile the old system had become. In the aftermath, Hollywood had no choice but to rethink how blockbusters were built in a new era of movie making. There is something deeply symbolic about 20th Century Fox choosing to tell the story of a queen navigating a collapsing world order at the exact moment the studio system itself was being forced to evolve. Cleopatra ruled at a moment when her empire was shifting beneath her feet, when power was no longer guaranteed and survival depended on strategy and influence. Hollywood found itself in much of the same position in the early 1960s, clinging to spectacle and star power in an attempt to assert dominance while the foundation beneath them was already changing. In that way, Cleopatra became more than a historical epic movie. It became a reflection of an aging empire fighting to prove it still ruled.